agriculture tends to go in quite significant shifts. It's not a continuous curve. It has quite severe angles in that change. So things go along for some time, then they have a kink. Things start changing. If you go right back, and often it's outside events. If you go back to sort of the Napoleonic Wars, the Corn Laws, the coming of railways and shipping, then the First World War, they all introduced significant changes, which took some long time. Well, the impact permeates through and then has a long-term shift. Remember the Corn Production Act in the First World War? Farmers thought that, well, the First World War was always going to be over in 5 minutes. And so farmers were not going to plow up land and put it into crops. And they were promised that they would get the guaranteed price for the duration of the war and 5 years after. That then became the Great Betrayal. There was a little bit of compensation by way of the Sugar Act. Things settled down a little bit in the 30s with empire preference. But then the Second World War led to the big shift and change. And that was then consolidated in the 1947 Agriculture Act. Now, maybe I just have to see that and nobody else. I can see what I want to show you, but you...
No, I can see that, Barry. Richard Thomas here.
Yeah, but across the whole of the screen or just a little bit at the side?
Both, really.
No, I think you're okay, Barry. I'll just carry on.
Right, okay, right. I'll carry on with that. Yeah. Maybe it's okay. What we've got then is 1947 really consolidated what had been happening during the war, that farmers should be given a sort of a preference. It was always weasel worded, only such proportion as is appropriate. In 47 that brought in deficiency payment scheme. Now the deficiency payment scheme, once you start paying farmers to produce things, they become very productive. And by 1956, 9 years later, the government was saying, hang on a minute, the cost of doing all this is too great. We're getting little bits of fiddling going on. And so they started to introduce what were referred to as standard quantities, which capped the amount. And that meant through the rest of the 50s and the 60s, the amount of support that farmers got was, we've got there, I think, in the end, was capped. And so it was gradually diluted. As you produce more, if you produce more wheat, the amount of subsidy for wheat was the same, and it just got diluted. The next huge change came just in the nick of time, in the sense that incomes were being diluted because the same amount of subsidy was spread. 1973, we joined the Common Agricultural Policy. And remember, the Common Agricultural Policy was a social policy. I'm always saying to you that when the Common Agricultural Policy started in 1956, a third of the French population was engaged in agriculture, and they were significantly poorer. And so it was a scheme to level up between the urban and rural. The problem was that led to, because we were getting technological innovation, a great increase in production. And so we had wine lakes and butter mountains and things. And so in 1995, they had to start controlling production. And that led to set aside quotas and things like that. In 2005, because of the World Trade Agreements, that system of subsidy to production to product had to stop, and it was replaced, but they couldn't not support farmers, and so they changed then to paying by area. So you've got the same amount of money, but by area. Now, we're now coming to another one of these very big shifts. Leaving the EU means we're into a whole new regime. The principle of which is that the basic payment scheme will be phased out. And the government will say it gives us a chance to do what we want. We're not tied in. We were always the odd one out in Europe. Our farms were significantly larger. Farmers weren't significantly poorer. Now, what do they want? They have said in a simple statement, public money for public good. So what they want is public good. Now, that becomes an issue. If we're going to get money, what's it going to be for? There are going to be, in what's going to be supported, the basic payment scheme will continue, but on a reducing basis. It'll be phased out. There's the idea that you simply pay so much per hectare to everybody. It's quite, you'll see in a minute, something interesting, other bits. What they will be looking at in terms of public good is environmental improvement. That's what they want. And what does that mean? What would be regarded as better management of land? Now, that's obviously very wide as what is better. And it is obviously the criteria for what is good and what is bad is in the eyes of the general population. One of the other things that they will want is better public access. The idea, the UK is odd in that we don't have big areas of forest. Forest is brilliant at letting people come in. You can lose an awful lot of people in a forest. We don't have that, particularly in the southeast of England. Once you get to the Midlands and you got through the Pennines, then you have got big areas and in the southwest. But public access will be an issue. And with that, they want to use educationally to get a better understanding of the environment. So things like interpretation, there'll be a lot of scope for that. What is it you're seeing? Can we get better public support? Remember, we have this situation that in continental Europe, people are not that far from the land. They're spread out much more. The UK, we have a very, very urban population who have not been, their ancestors have not been involved in farming for 6, 7, 8 generations. They're very separated. So interpretation becomes important. Cultural heritage is an interesting, what do they mean by that? Well, just what the place looks like, making it sort of pretty. We'll come back to hedges. Hedges are, I think, one of the things which will be very significant. Now, one of the things I can't do today is to tell you all the details of the scheme because we don't know them, but we can start to see the general direction of travel. So things like hedges and dry stone walls. Climate change is going to be a big driver in everything the government does. And that's linked also to protection from environmental hazards. And one of the big ones of that, which is well underway in a way, is flooding, how we can protect places from flooding, allowing water to get into the soil better. Other ones are things like health and welfare of livestock. That could be quite significant. We've already seen phasing out of sow stalls, battery cages. That's going to be a significant area of general improvement. And that could be quite significant. So you've got all this thing about American meat and things. A slightly odd one, conserving native livestock. And that really comes in protecting plant health. We've seen a lot of disease, not just in agricultural crops, but things like ash dieback, elm, losing all the elms. So things like that become significant. Another slightly esoteric one, conserving plants for genetic diversity. We are going to see that we realize there's a whole pool of genes out there which we could do something with, and that's one of the things that will be coming. And remember, we are free to genetically modify if we want to now. One big driving issue will be improving the quality of soil. And that will take the form of various things. Improving quality of soil comes back to issues like flooding. Can water get in? We've seen in some places things like with maize, soil washed off maize fields onto roads. Flooding, flash flooding, but also carbon capture. How can we manage soils to contain and store carbon? Soils have a huge potential to store carbon, and that's one of the things. It becomes slightly complicated how you actually organize a scheme to do it, how do you get payment for it, but that will be things. And any quick questions at that point? Who's going to be bold enough? Okay, we'll press on. No, I got it wrong. Yes. Sorry, we've gone. Sorry, we're technical performance is not good today. Why has that happened? Sorry, we'll get back to. All right. No, wait on that one. Oh. Sorry. Right. Okay, so let's look at how they're intending to apply this. One of the things they're looking for is that farmers should, in general terms, be less dependent on subsidy. We know, for example, that I think the figure quoted is 46% of farmers, if they didn't have the basic payment scheme, would have made a loss. You've come back on, John. So improving productivity, that can be supporting ancillary activities. So improve selling. One of the things also in the Agriculture Act is this relationship between producers and buyers in terms of supermarkets, how we can improve the share of the end price that farmers get. Always been an issue. Farmers are weak sellers. So marketing becomes important, and there will be money for that. Preparing and packaging, how we can get greater added value. So it isn't just about production schemes, it is these other schemes as well. Now, if we just go back to some of the changes, the things that are going to disappear, we know already announced the changes to the basic payment scheme. It runs until 2027. They've said there'll be a 7-year transition period, but they will be reduced over time. Now, there are also that payments can be delinked. In other words, there will come a point, we'll come to in a minute, where it will be possible for farmers to say, I will take some subsidy, but without the need to farm in order to get it. And that will be, there will be opportunities for lump sums. One of the things that the government have said is they would like, as they always have done, is to get more young people in. And so one of the things that will come up is this ability of a farmer effectively to retire and take a lump sum. Now that could be quite significant on tenanted farms, where the outgoing tenant says, thank you very much, I'll have the lump sum, and I'll hand you back a farm with a different subsidy regime. that's something to be watching out for. We now know that the rate of is announced. We know, and this operates on a system like income tax. It's on a tiered system. So the first £30,000 of everybody payment is reduced by 5%. If you've got more than 30,000, the next 20,000 between 30 and 50,000 is cut by 10%. If you're over 50, the next 100,000 is cut by 20%. And then if you're going over 150, it's cut by 25%. So as you get more subsidy, so the cut gets bigger. So that a 100-acre farmer in this year, and that's already 2021, would lose £469. A 320-acre farmer loses £1,500. 1,600-acre farmer, 23.5, and somebody on 2,500 is up to nearly 50,000 reduction. Now those cuts increase year by year. And they also, as you've seen, the larger the payment, the bigger the cut. So they were the ones we've just had, 5, 10, 20, and 25 for this year, this claim year. The next claim year, that will all go up initially by another 15%. So 5% goes up to 20% on the first 30,000, 10 goes to 25, 20 goes to 35, and 25 only goes up to 15. It goes up by another 15 to 40%. So you can see the cuts are starting to bite. By the following year, everybody has lost 40% of their first tier, 50% of their second tier, 50% if they're over 100,000, over 50,000. And if you're over 150,000, you're going to lose 55%. And then the cuts are only announced until 2024. But you can see it's half of the first 30,000, 65% of the next 20,000, 65% of the next 100,000, and if you're over 150,000, it's 70% of anything more. So we can see that the cuts are pretty big. Now that, yes, come and have a say.
Barry, one question. Sorry, it might sound silly. Is the initial 30,000, etc., frozen, or are they going to take a percentage of what was left from last year?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's of, I think it's of the original.
Right, so it's the 30,000, 50,000 is the original.
That's a good point, actually, because obviously as you cut it, more and more people are going into the...
Yeah.
That's a good point. Anybody know? Anybody ideas on that?
It would be sensible if they froze it in time, because then everybody affected
you would know,
way.
yes, but it is but because it would smooth it out as or everybody drops down a bit. It's a good point. No one's raised that, and I don't know the answer. That's your homework. Right. Sorry.
Thank you. Cheers. Everything's up in the air.
But it is a good point. Yeah. I mean, this is the thing. I think really what we're looking at is we don't know the exact direction. We know the general direction, and we need to be start thinking now. It's no good waiting until, because a lot of these things take time to put a scheme together and to plan what you want to do. I mean, for someone to think about retiring early, it takes a bit of time to think about it. So the government have said,
sorry, I might be labouring the point, but the person who retires as a tenant farmer, if he takes his single payment or he takes his lump sum, obviously the farm then comes back to the landlord without any subsidy. Is that correct?
That's a possible. We don't know exactly the implications, but if you are going to have people take lump sums, which in effect I suspect is a rolled up payment.
Yeah.
That could leave your farm without the subsidy.
So that there's no safety net going forward then for that situation.
We don't know is the answer. It's something to be conscious of.
All right.
Lots,
Thank you.
Okay.
lots of tenants, if they do that, are going to be in breach of their tenancy agreement, aren't they?
You're going to be, when it's
Yeah.
going to be dilapidatable, which in effect would mean that if you dilapidated it, it would be basically the landlord would tend to, the dilapidations would equate, if the tenant gets the rolled up sum and the landlord doesn't get, won't have the rolled up sum, the two sums are the same. So the lump sum goes to the landlord rather than the tenant, in effect. If you think about it, it would be something along those lines. But
Something to think through, I think.
it's going to be a difference between tenants and owner occupiers. I mean, you did have at the time, Douglas can tell us, in Scotland, where you had land with subsidy on it and land without, and people could tenants could keep the subsidy. Okay, now the government have said that they are going to keep the subsidy the same through until 2024, the end of this parliament. Now, what that means is the direct payments, which already this year will have dropped from 100, well, not quite 100%, direct payments, the basic payment will drop to only 68% of what it was, down to 55, then 48, and then 34. There's prosperity, this is the other schemes, roughly staying the same, 9 or 10%. But the big change is the environmental, the proportion of money that's going to environmental and animal welfare. So by 2024, which is not that far ahead, nearly, well, 57%, more than half the money of the subsidy is going to go for environmental and animal welfare, and only 34% of the money is going for the direct payments. So in other words, if you do nothing, you're joining the 34 and not staying on the 57. So, I mean, you can see that for a farmer who benefits from the environmental slice, they can keep their money up to 80, 91% of what they're getting now. So the big shift has got to be to how do I qualify for the environmental payments. In putting it into money terms, the money that's being reallocated, 179 million this year, 400 odd next year, 700 the next year, and then roughly $1 billion in the 24-25. So we're talking about quite serious sums of money there to be had. Now, one we've just touched on already is this ability to de-link so that they can take a lump sum. Now, one of the things we know is that you can't say, right, I will take my lump sum as a multiple of the payment rate in the first year. So that's going to be on the diminishing figure. It's not in the scheme. The Act empowers ministers to introduce a scheme. Remember, the Agriculture Act is very much an enabling act. It enables the ministers to introduce schemes for this and schemes for that. And until we have the details of those schemes, and we know it's going to be a little while yet before we get those, but it's time to be thinking about what we want your future to be. Now, so where you've got schemes, remember the European Act incorporated all the old things into UK law, but the Agriculture Act allows ministers to modify them. So, for example, it can say, right, we can change the requirements for cross-compliance. We can change the penalties for failing to, for breaching cross-compliance. We can scrap the 3-crop rule, and we can change the rural development regulations. So although we start off with the existing regime, it's quite possible for ministers to change those. Somebody trying to ask something? Okay. So we've got a lot more flexibility now to change things. Now we're in what's referred to as the transition plan, the transition period going up to 2027. The 3 components of that: environmental land management. This is really the crucial thing that we will be striving for, and that we need to get our heads round, understanding what it's about. And that will be the Sustainable Farming Initiative. That will be the universal scheme. That, if anything, is going to replace basic payment, it's that one. That's a payment for doing farming in a certain way, following certain accepted rules, which is, we have the good agricultural policies now. It'll be along those lines. Soil health will be a big issue there, of how we improve soil, particularly on things like carbon, for that. But water quality, we're already getting that. There's water companies introducing schemes for catchment management. And remember, from the government point of view, it's quite attractive to introduce forms of subsidy which are not paid for by the government. So if you can persuade water companies to pay money for farmers in their catchment to do that, that's benefit to farmers at no cost to the government. Equally, you've got the situation of things like carbon capture. Can we introduce sources of income by that, which again is money not having to be financed by the government? Hedgerows, this idea of what the countryside looks like. We know that we can see from countryside stewardship, a lot of those things will be, extensions of the sort of things. We're not starting from scratch. Planting hedgerows will be things, partly because they look good. They are ways of getting trees in without taking out a lot of land. They provide really good benefits in wildlife, hedges connecting isolated woods and things like that. Really good. Remember, a hedge is a lot of woodland edge, and that's where a lot of benefit to birds and things happens. Birds live in the hedge, come out to feed back into the hedge. Pest control, we're going to be looking at less sprays and how can we manage cropping to reduce those things. Local nature, you could see these schemes start to overlap. Countryside stewardship will continue for a year or two and actually get a bit more money. But this local nature recovery, a new scheme which is going to gradually replace countryside stewardship. So woodlands will be a big issue. How can we create woods? Woods are seen as popular, as I said. They're very good for public amenity, and people, I think people will be, and landowners will be looking at not planting the whole place up to trees, but they will be looking at parts of the farm which they might say, right, this would be better suited to something else, and woodlands will be that with some money attached to it. One of the things is ecosystem services. This comes back a bit, I was saying about catchment management. What services do farmers produce? We know, for example, managing floodwaters, water going in, quality of water, carbon capture, all these things. And we have to emphasize the value of those. One of the difficulties is you sell a ton of wheat off a field, you can see exactly what you've sold. If you say we've captured a ton of carbon, how do we measure that? That becomes much more difficult. But that's the sort of thinking that we're going to have to go into. As I say, for the next couple of years, there's a bit of extra money for countryside stewardship as a sort of bridging into the local nature recovery. Again, on a bigger scale, landscape recovery, changes to land use. One of the things particularly, for example, will be upland areas. We have been busy trying to extend agriculture into moorland areas. We've had grants ever since the war of trying to drain peat bogs. And they're now realizing, hang on a minute, the very last thing we want to do is to drain a peat bog. So how do we want to manage land in terms of visual appearance, public access, carbon capture, all these things? We're going to have to look on a sort of a broader canvas than producing milk and wheat. So things that significantly enhance the landscape in the views of the general public. Remember, that will be the thing. We get a lot of talk about rewilding. And I think there's a difference between restoring what are sort of traditionally wild landscapes, moorland, mountain areas and things like that. In other words, we're going to stop trying to upgrade them in agricultural terms. A little bit on rewilding. I mean, you get Knapp Castle is always quoted, but there's going to be, I think, less of that. There will be odd little patches which people would have said, and landlords might have said, that's really untidy and scruffy. That will be seen as being perhaps beneficial in small bits. We want to have the target is by 2030, 30% of the UK's land in some sort of managed better system. So that's the nature recovery network. So there is going to be this big push. And remember, 57% of the money is on environmental payments. Any bits there? It's very difficult to butt in, but we could have a session of butting in if you.
Oh, it's fine, Barrie.
Okay.
Anybody want to be bold enough? It is a fairly fundamental change that we've been taking out hedges to improve mechanization and to cope with a much smaller labor force and technology. There's going to be a shift, and we're going to have to work out how we do it. And one of the things you need to be thinking about is what suits a particular holding. Is this farm? Some farms are going to say, we're just going to go producing as much wheat as we can, as much sugar beet as we can. Other places are going to say, we can't, we need to be looking at what we can do in terms of how do we make ourselves attractive. And that is quite significant, because in terms of valuation, you can think of some farms which in the past, I can think of a particular farm in Dorset I can know quite well. There's an area of water meadows beside the river. There's a block of scrubby alder carr, sort of wet woodland. And then there's some rather light arable land. Now, that one you might have said, oh, it's all right, it's got irrigation, but what's it like? But suddenly you say, but those water meadows, that woodland, that really fits in to the sort of things we want to be doing in the future. So what on one sort of place it suits one thing, another place something else. There will be this idea of productivity. We want to have farmers, the idea is that they should have sustainable businesses that don't rely on public subsidies. I say 46% of farmers would not be making a profit if they didn't have the subsidy. And the idea is what in the government's dream would be, we'll put some money in now and get everybody weaned off subsidy altogether. I think they accept that's not going to happen, but they're saying if we're going to pay any money, we're only going to pay money for things we like. We're not going to pay a flat rate payment to everybody. And as we can see, one of the interesting things is just going back to, you think the larger the subsidy, the more you cut. Bizarrely, for many, many years, the UK government has always resisted a cap on subsidy, because we had much bigger farms, and Common Agricultural Policy was one of the few ways in which the UK got money back from Europe. And since we had larger farms, to cap it, we would have lost out more than anybody else. But as soon as the UK government is paying out of the Treasury, suddenly capping becomes a good idea. So the idea of universal payment for everybody, you can see that dwindling. If we're going to part with money, we want it not to sustain unprofitable businesses, but we want it to give us public good. So we want people to be managing their whole business in a way that delivers profitable food production and the recovery of nature. And what they're sort of looking at is fusing modern technology with good husbandry. In other words, you don't spray everything badly, you use your technology wisely. And there is tremendous potential there. We have seen with if you think about with COVID, in terms of just being us doing this morning, things have moved on very quickly. I was looking last night at robotic lawnmowers. Well, it's quite feasible. Not long ago, it would have been complete science fiction to think of having something like along the lines of a Husqvarna robotic lawnmower, not mowing, but detecting, going one robot going down a single row of wheat with a little blade, which every so often it says, that's not wheat, and it knocks it out. So, and that's quite technically feasible. You might need a lot of them in a field, but things like that, electronically identifying things. We've seen, if you think about it with GPS, we can farm, I know people who have had to change their GPS system because it wasn't accurate enough. It was only accurate to 3 inches, and you want to be much more accurate than that. So we're getting, the technology is there that we can do things in a different way. So we're looking for, how do we access public money to get those environmental animal welfare outcomes? That will be one of the crucial things. That will, and in ways which gets their business to be productive and sustainable. Sustainable will be one of the big issues. Clear standards. Remember, one of the things we've already seen is if we want to protect UK farmers against competing, and this is one of the difficulties, how do you compete with countries who have lower standards? And if you can have lower standards, then it's harder for people to have better standards if it costs more. And so they're trying, we've got to show that what we're doing is somehow better, and therefore we are justified in saying you can't import hormone beef or something like that because we don't have it. Preventing environmental harm. How do we do things which stop bad things happening? The pandemic, in a way, has made us look much more how vulnerable we are. And I was looking at something the other day. We've looked at who, it's the anniversary today. Who would have said, that we can shut the country down for a year? Well, not whole of a year, but for a big chunk of a year. But supposing we now said we have got another disease in which every pig in the world must be killed, or every beef animal in the world must be killed. Issues like that. We realize, you know, we are quite vulnerable. So biosecurity, we can see we've already got security on people, but we've seen in recent years things like ash dieback coming from imports. So biosecurity is going to be an issue. And animal welfare, this idea that we won't allow you, other countries, to send poor quality or animals produced under poorer welfare. And that one will have public support. It's an easier one to sell that, why you can't have cheap meat. It's easier to say you can't have cheap steak if it's hormone filled. You've got a better chance of getting your message over. Now, one of the things we know a little bit of how schemes will start and the transition from where we are now. This one gets quite complicated. The new countryside, sure, you can still have new agreements for the next 3 years. Testing and trialing of new things will start now because we're really looking at environmental land management's ELM schemes. They've got pilot schemes running for that. So they're starting, and then we will go on to the proper schemes. Then tree health is agreed for 3 years, but not confirmed thereafter. The sustainable farming incentive, which will be the main thing, should start in 2022-23, and that will be the new major scheme. Nature recovery to start a bit later. Landscape recovery starting at the same time, 24-25. In the meantime, in protected areas, so upland areas, protected landscapes, there is an interim scheme which starts in now until the new scheme starts. Then we have got, you can't see it for some reason, animal welfare starting in. Investment funds, sorry, that end has come round from the end. So investment fund, grant aid for capital works. And again, these, remember, are only till 25, 26. If you've got schemes, you need to be putting your house in order, thinking about those schemes sooner. Research and development, they start straight away. Where people are innovative, they can bid for grant to show how what they're doing is applicable to other people. Slurry, there's an interim scheme for dealing with that. They're the sort of schemes, pollution will be seen as very bad, adequate storage of slurry, adequate systems for handling it. Resilience, how do we survive? Some money for changeover there. This new entrance is money initially for 2 years, but then to be confirmed. The direct payments, as we've said, that's the residual of the basic payment scheme, that carries on until the 27-28 year. Lump sum payments start, we think, next year, but that's to be confirmed. Delinking, in other words, you can have money without having any land at all, coming in 24-25. So they're the sort of changes. Now, from a land agent's point of view, just a few things there. Schedule 3 is quite a long schedule, but doesn't actually do an awful lot. It's a long schedule because we keep having to refer to every other act where certain words appear. But it changes the anything referring to arbitration. It now refers to third-party determination because it can be determined by people other than an arbitrator. So that removes arbitration under this act becomes in accordance with the this section. So it could still be arbitration, or it could be third-party determination. If both parties agree, the third party can be appointed at any time before the review date. You could appoint in a tenancy agreement, I think you could appoint who should be there. The important thing will be to watch the situation if you're talking about determination and you get coming up to your deadlines and no one has been appointed, and you might then say, right, we've got to seek an appointment of an arbitrator to preserve the situation. The range of who can appoint arbitrators has increased from just the president of the RICS now to be the president of the CAAV and the chair of the Agricultural Law Association. So if you can ask for an arbitrator to be appointed by any one of those. And that can apply equally to variations, all these things, for variations of the terms of the tenancy. And that could be quite significant if we're starting to change some of the fundamental things of what can be done on a farm. Clearly, if you've got a tenancy and there's a question of planting hedges, planting woodland, rewilding, those would be quite significant, and they could be issues which you might say, I've got to get a variation in the terms of the tenancy for that. And that could be by a third party. And that might be, as I say, particularly to get access into schemes. Because you might say, I've got to sign up for something for carbon capture, or but I need to come out of that. There are little things specifically where the landlord is financing improvements and the tenant is still paying for it, that's disregarded, and the benefit to the tenant while they're still paying. So they're not, it's basically to take out double payment. The other important change is retirement notices. It used to be you couldn't serve retirement notice before the age of 65. That's now replaced by the state pension age. The state pension age we know is creeping up, and that changes. Where you're looking for succession, this is not change, but it's provision for changing, that the minister can, by regulation, change the commercial unit test. Because remember, at the moment, you can't have a successor who is already occupying a commercial unit. Suitability, a test, is the candidate suitable? That can be changed again. These aren't changed, but remember, the Act is an enabling Act. It allows for regulations to change that. In terms of suitability, the sort of criteria you look at is their ability to farm commercially, to a high standard of efficiency, and to take care of the environment. In other words, how do we believe they were farming? What do their plans do? How do they fit in? Suitability can also take in experience. Do they have enough experience? Do they have adequate training? Do they have adequate skills in agriculture and business management? Physical health. That's a tricky one, because with disability discrimination, we're pretty anti-discriminating against people, but that could be, are they physically capable of doing something? Financial standing. Do they have the capital to be able to do that? Have they had previous financial problems? A strange one, character. They're a slippery character. I'm not going to give them the tenancy. How, that we don't know. I mean, but it makes it legitimate to do that. The other one is in terms of the actual holding itself. What is the character of the holding? So you could have the argument that this holding is very suited for this, and that isn't what the successor is proposing to do. So that could be an issue. the condition that the holding is in. In other words, is it in very poor condition, it needs a lot of work doing on it, or it's in very good condition and it needs somebody to maintain it. So that's legitimate. The terms of the tenancy are part of the suitability test. In terms of succession, you don't have, the tenant doesn't have to be over 65. So you can have, and this again, if this idea of the government of wanting of new entrants, you might be having tenants who, say, in their late 50s, decide the new world is not for me. I would like to get my son in now. And so you could well have tenants coming early saying, let's have a look at doing this. And again, landlords start to need thinking. It could be really good for landlords. It gets over a tail end of someone who is now a bit, not to be ageist, but is now getting a bit weary. Let's have their son who's much more young and dynamic. You might be encouraging that. We've said that already, that they can have that one. Right. Now. Right. So we've got these changes coming up. We don't know all the details, but we know that you should be using this as thinking time. How do I want to, on any particular holding, our holding, on estates, do we see this tenant as the one to be leaving and handing over to the son? What do we want? This particular holding, is this one which is going to remain commercial and go for crop production, and therefore we would look at spending money on a grain store, but this other holding, we think their future is something on a low key, environmental issues being much more important. So now is the time to be thinking about the future. People tend to take time to do that, and it's wise. We don't know the details of the schemes. We've got rough ideas, but we do know that some holdings are going to be much more suited to go down the environmental route. How can we make that work? Diversification, we know, is very dependent on location. What suits in one place just doesn't work somewhere else. But points, we've just done our hour. Anybody want to butt in? Please butt in. For some reason, I have John Thompson fully occupying my screen.
How fortunate are you, Barrie?
Yeah, well, there you are.
Yeah, my concern is the impact on valuation at the end of all of this.
Yeah.
It seems to me that the subsidy arrangements that we currently have find their way to the freeholder or the landlord, simply because one signs the bottom of a piece of paper and draws the 80 or 100 pounds an acre. Interest rates are now so low that 80 or 100 pounds an acre equates to a high value of land by using that as a multiplier.
Yeah, yeah.
You take all that away, and now you make whatever payments to farmers will be linked to environmental matters. Those will have to be earned. The farmer will have to put time and money in to attract those things.
Yeah.
In which case, and now, did you say in 4 years' time, the subsidy will be divorced from occupied?
Well, has the potential. We don't know. They've said that they might do that, but you're quite right that they've already said that they want to try to, in terms of cross compliance, they want to be slightly less officious than the Rural Payment Agency. The Rural Payment Agency has always said, we have to do this because we're accountable to the auditors in Brussels. Now, no other people in Brussels, they've never produced an audited set of accounts for the EU ever, but the Rural Payment Agency did try hard. So cross-compliance and penalties will be perhaps softened a little bit, but you're quite right, Nick, that these things are, you say, right, I've planted up a hedge and I'm required to maintain it, and we don't, and suddenly your money's gone. Or the person who planted it, you could be left with a farm, a tenanted farm, where the existing tenant was very keen on doing was wildlife. He planted up things, but then you haven't got somebody else who with that same inclination or enthusiasm, or you are suddenly left with a farm to let, which has got to be somebody let to somebody who is really keen on maintaining wildlife corridors and looking after birds. So there are different vulnerabilities. You're right.
But isn't what really is going to happen that we're just going to have more of the same, and that the majority of commercial farmers are going to simply focus on producing food? There's going to be more emphasis, particularly after COVID and Brexit, on self-sufficiency and food security, and that therefore what you've been talking about for the last hour is going to be relevant, and elms and all that sort of stuff. But in the grand scheme of things, we're going to get more large farms, fewer farmers, and yes, a move to carbon capture and all those other sort of technological things that you've spoken about. But I think that it's going to be quite low down on the overall spectrum, and that the main thrust is going to still be to produce food, because actually that's what most farmers want to do.
It's what most farmers want to do, but I think you'll get a split between, you're right, that there'll be some people who, I'm really good at producing, and I want to grow mega crops of wheat, and they will do it. They will do it in ways which fit in with environmental issues, but there'll be other people who say, I can't, there's not enough just by an area basis. I have got to do something which attracts quite a big element of environmental payments, and therefore I will have this as be an all grass farm with big hedges and a bit more woodland and things like that, and that way I can make something out of this. And it may be I get the money out of just looking after it on a part-time basis, and I think you'll get this split.
Yeah, well, exactly, but that's going to be very much driven by the type of farm,
Yes,
and also by the size of farm. So
yeah,
a small farmer who can't make any money commercially, or a marginal farm who's got the same problem, is going to look more at these schemes rather than a 1,000, 2,000 hectare arable farmer.
Yes, because they're going to say, look, I have got this investment in equipment that I need to do this and produce this on a big, I'm not going to suddenly say, right, I want to have 10-acre fields, because that's not what suits me. But other people, so you are going to get this split between food, a bigger proportion of food coming from a fewer producers, and other people concentrating more on amenity farming in a way. But again, it's very dependent on area, because, you know, well, I suppose the one thing about the scheme is it pays you for environmental work, irrespective of anybody ever comes to see it. If you were doing it as a visitor attraction, and you were in the middle of nowhere, no visitors, it wouldn't work. But environmental payments don't actually require anybody to come and look at the landscape.
Yeah.
So,
can I chip in? Barrie, it's Robert Crawford Clark.
Yeah,
here.
hello.
I think the discussion seems to be suggesting basically that the East Anglia grain barons will continue to be the East Anglia grain barons, and I agree to extent, but it seems to me, though, there will still be limits, even on those people who the die hard produce as much food as you can, because of all these factors such as soil preservation, water quality, etc. Everyone's going to have to be dragged, even if it's kicking and screaming, to a certain extent, to a different way of farming to deal with those aspects.
Yeah. Yes, I think you're right. There will be emphasis, for example, direct drilling rather than ploughing.
Yes,
which is equally applicable. Winter cover crops, things like that are going to be equally applicable to the large-scale arable people. I mean, it's already happening. You know, that's not new. That's, you know, this year was quite noticeable. There wasn't a lot of bare ground around.
No.
But yes, and people will adapt, and people will plant up some trees in an odd bit. People will look at field margins and say, look, that bit of doesn't suit my 24-foot header combine. I'm going to go for, something small, that bit I'm going to put into something else, which I can now do.
Yes. But one little point as well, just to throw in, is the whole issue of soil preservation and the benefits of direct drilling and zero tillage and so on that brings. How does that work with the elephant in the room that glyphosate might get banned in the next few years? Just put that out there.
Yeah. Well,
take glyphosate out of modern farming, and well, it's hard to see how it works, really. Yeah.
Well, yes, I think people would. There was a world before you used to dehulm potatoes by spraying sulfuric acid at them,
yeah.
Which was, you might be back into acids and things. But I think we have got mechanical ways of doing with things now, which will. But you're right. It's all very well to ban things. I mean, we've seen that with neonicotinoids issues there. But we are having a bit more freedom now. Not in other words, if the EU bans it, we don't have to ban it. But there will be perhaps other less. Well, I mean, glyphosate is a funny one because nobody's actually ever said it does any harm, except a few people in California.
Yeah, but one could certainly see in the EU the direction of travel was heading towards banning it.
Yeah.
And whether we would then follow, I don't know. But
it's going to be difficult, although we've got the situation now where I think we're quite relishing not being in the EU in terms of vaccines, aren't we?
Yeah.
And it may well be that we're happier to be a bit more divergent. Anybody else? Somebody else be bold. If you want to wave, I can see some people. We ought to have from John Downing and Barons of North Norfolk. He's not rising to the.
No.
Hello,
below the parapet.
Hello, Barrie.
Hello, John.
Good morning. Yes, I've been very interested to hear what you've had to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think people will. I mean, you're an estate which will adapt to some bits going one way and other bits going another way, won't they?
Yeah, precisely. Yes, there will always be little corners here and there which are suitable for planting and hedging.
Yeah,
and just as a sort of small fact that has arisen recently, we discovered that the hedging that we've planted over the last few years of stewardship and HLS would stretch from the estate office to Norwich Airport. So yeah, of course, interesting.
Oh, they just come in the post. Yeah. Oh, brilliant! Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, this is it, and I think people. What we'll do, for example, people will start looking at. I mean, there's quite interesting in last week's Farmers Weekly, looking at. You've got a hedgerow already, but it's a pretty grotty, gappy, useless hedge. It's not really much good for anything. And I think people will start saying, right, it's a reasonable place to have a hedge. If I'm going to have a hedge there, I might as well make it a half decent one and get some money. It's quite good money for planting hedges. It's quite expensive, but you will start to say, right, I will repair poor hedges and get them back in and get some money that way. So it isn't just a question of putting a hedge across a field. Beside tracks and things like that, there are places where you can put a hedge in, and as I say, connecting wildlife corridors becomes quite significant. Anybody else who is glad they're getting close to retirement?
Yeah.
I mean, there will be. I mean, when things like this happen, there will always be people to say, "Look, I don't want to bother to get my head round it," and that will be father to son in some cases. And landlord will say to some tenants, why don't you let your son, he's really keen on this sort of thing, we'll do some arrangement to do a transfer of the tenancy to them. And there will be, remember, landlords, I always think it's a salutary thing for land agents to, I am old, and in my lifetime, I can point out, I can name farms where they had great difficulty getting a tenant, and they accepted a less than perfect tenant because they couldn't get anybody. And there are going to be some holdings where landlords are going to say, if I can't get somebody to sort of manage that for me, what's going to happen?
What about you, Barry? Are you going to adopt this format going forward?
No, I want to come and see you. I want to come and hug you in a room. because we have this difficulty now, the exact business we're in at this very moment. It's quite difficult. I mean, there's fewer of you today, but when we had the other day, we had 100. It really doesn't work. And also, you might be cautious because you've got people we've got people who are pledged an oath of allegiance to Nicola Sturgeon, who are now having to suddenly say, but some of this applies to us and some of it doesn't. We've got people from the borders, Herefordshire, Tim in Herefordshire, and then John Downing in North Norfolk. So you've got, whereas normally would be much more local, so you've got things like that. So I hope to be on the road soon. See you then.
Thank you, Barry.
Any other bits?
Thank you.
Okay. Anything else? We'll call it a
Thank
day.
you very much.
Okay.
Thanks, Barry.
Okay.
Thank you very much indeed.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.